Blood and screams splattered across Alexander Robertson's face as he battered the massive alien's corpse with his rifle stock, ensuring nothing could harm his people. At 78, the memory still haunted the grizzled vet. He wiped sweat from his brow, preparing to recount humanity's greatest conflict. Back then, Alexander was an untested human lieutenant aboard the starship HMS Defiant. Deltans, an advanced insectoid race, were humanity's allies on a joint peacekeeping mission to war-ravaged planet Zephyrus. Tensions crackled from the start. Young Alexander led human troops beside battle-hardened Deltan warrior Fornax. Cultural rifts made cooperation difficult. Escalating threats included vicious beasts and militant Zephyrian factions. Clashing tactics fractured the shaky alliance as body counts rose. Disaster struck when a devastating ambush scattered the peacekeepers. Cut off and vastly outnumbered, Alexander and Fornax had to unite or perish. Survival, the mission, and the fate of their civilizations hung by a thread. But even if they triumphed here, the embittered veteran's voice dropped low. A looming betrayal would soon shatter everything Alexander believed about their allies. Humanity was always alone. Alexander's voice grew heavier as he continued recounting the events. Amidst the chaos of the attack, Fornax and I led our battered forces to a nearby abandoned Zephyrian fortress. We sought shelter and a defensible position to regroup. As we worked to fortify the location and tend to our wounded, I stumbled upon a shocking discovery: a hidden cache of advanced Deltan weaponry. This tech was far beyond anything our peacekeeping mission had been equipped with. The old veteran's eyes narrowed. I confronted Fornax, demanding an explanation. The Deltan warrior reluctantly revealed that their true mission was not peacekeeping, but the covert acquisition of Zephyrian technology. The Deltans had orchestrated the entire conflict on Zephyrus to weaken the planet's defenses, allowing them to secure the advanced tech for themselves. Alexander's fists clenched. Fornax admitted that the Deltans never intended to honor their alliance with us humans. They saw us merely as pawns in their larger scheme. Furious at the betrayal, I confronted the Deltan leadership via a secure communication link, only to be met with cold indifference. The Deltan commander made it clear that we humans were expendable and that the Deltans would stop at nothing to achieve their goals. The old soldier's voice was grim. As the rogue Zephyrian faction closed in on our position, I realized that my fellow humans and I had been left to die by our supposed allies. With no choice but to fight for our survival, I rallied my troops, determined to find a way out of this impossible situation. Alexander's tone grew resolute. What followed was a desperate battle, with our outnumbered human forces fighting tooth and nail against both the Zephyrians and the treacherous Deltans. We were low on ammo, supplies, and hope, but we were determined to survive, to make it back to our ship and warn Earth of the Deltans' betrayal. We would not go quietly into the night. The sounds of gunfire and explosions seemed to echo in the veteran's ears as he spoke. Human soldiers took cover behind. Crumbling walls and shattered windows as the Zephyrians unleashed a barrage of fire upon their position. Alexander gritted his teeth, his rifle bucking against his shoulder as he returned fire. The air was thick with the stench of smoke and the cries of the wounded. "They've got us pinned down," shouted Sergeant Hansen, ducking as a blast sent shards of stone flying overhead. Alexander knew they couldn't hold out much longer. The Zephyrians were relentless, throwing wave after wave of soldiers at their defenses. The humans were running low on ammo and medical supplies. They needed a miracle. That's when it hit him. The Deltan weapons cache. If they could just get those weapons operational, they might stand a chance. Alexander grabbed Private Chen, the team's tech specialist. "Chen, with me. We're going to get those Deltan weapons working for us." Under heavy fire, Alexander and Chen sprinted to the cache, dodging enemy shots and leaping over rubble. They reached the stockpile, and Chen set to work, his hands flying over the unfamiliar technology. "I think I can modify these to be compatible with our systems, sir, but it's going to take time." Alexander nodded grimly. "We'll buy you that time, just make it happen." He rallied his soldiers, organizing them into small guerrilla units. They set traps and ambushes, hitting the Zephyrians hard and fast before melting away into the ruins. It was a deadly game of cat and mouse, but it bought Chen the precious minutes he needed. Just as the Zephyrian forces were closing in, Chen let out a triumphant shout. "I've got it, sir, and I think I can rig up an EMP device from these components. It should knock out their advanced weaponry." A plan formed in Alexander's mind, a desperate, dangerous gambit. He gathered his most trusted soldiers. "We're going to infiltrate their camp, plant this EMP, and get out before they know what hit them. It's our only shot." The narrator leaned forward, his voice tense. "I can still remember the fear, the adrenaline pumping through my veins as we snuck through enemy lines. Every shadow was a threat, every sound a potential alarm." They were deep in the heart of the Zephyrian camp when a shot rang out. Fornax stepped from the darkness, flanked by Deltan soldiers. "Alexander," he hissed, "I should have known you'd try something foolish." Alexander felt a rush of fury. "Foolish? You betrayed us, Fornax. We were allies." Fornax laughed coldly. "Allies? You humans were merely tools, and now you've outlived your usefulness." They clashed in a brutal melee, human and Deltan locked in mortal combat. As they grappled, Alexander looked into Fornax's eyes. "Is this what honor means to you? Betraying those who fought beside you?" For a fleeting instant, something flickered in Fornax's expression. Doubt, regret. But before he could speak, a shot cracked the air. Fornax crumpled, a Zephyrian sniper's round through his skull. In the chaos, Alexander and his team surged forward. They planted the EMP, the device humming to life. Then they ran, desperately trying to put distance between themselves and the imminent blast. The EMP detonated just as the Zephyrians began their final push. A pulse of energy washed over the battlefield, shorting out weapons and sending the enemy into disarray. Alexander's voice rose in triumph as he described the EMP's devastating impact on the Zephyrian forces. The advanced alien weaponry fizzled and died, sparks erupting from fried circuits. Soldiers staggered in confusion, suddenly stripped of their technological advantage. The human forces seized the moment, surging forward with a fierce battle cry. "Attack!" Alexander roared, leading the charge himself. Rifles blazed as the humans pressed their advantage, driving the Zephyrians back through the rubble-strewn streets. Zephyrian soldiers fell, cut down by the relentless human assault. Finally the Zephyrians broke, retreating in disarray. A ragged cheer went up from the human lines, but Alexander knew their respite was only temporary. Even now, Zephyrian reinforcements would be on their way. "Scavenge what you can," he ordered his troops. "Ammo, medical supplies, anything useful. We're not out of this yet." As his soldiers set to their grim task, Alexander found himself alone with his thoughts. Fornax's betrayal weighed heavy on his soul. The Deltans, their supposed allies, had used them as mere pawns in their game. And now, because of that treachery, good men lay dead. "Can we ever trust them again?" he wondered aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "Can humanity ever find true allies among the stars, or are we destined to stand alone?" These were the thoughts that haunted Alexander as he watched his battered troops regroup. They had survived this battle, but at what cost? And what new horrors awaited them? As if in answer to his darkest musings, the comm unit at Alexander's belt crackled to life. "Lieutenant Robertson, this is the Defiant. We've been attacked. A Deltan cruiser. They caught us by surprise. We're dead in the water. Main power is offline, life support failing. We can't hold out much longer." Alexander's blood ran cold. The Defiant, their only lifeline, their only way home, crippled by the very race they had called friends. "Lieutenant Robertson, this is Commander Zardox of the Deltan battlecruiser Imperius. Your ship is at our mercy. Your forces on the ground are surrounded and outnumbered. Surrender now, and your lives may be spared. Resist, and you will all perish." Alexander looked to the faces of his soldiers, battered and bloodied but unbroken. In their eyes he saw the same fire that burned in his own heart. "We don't surrender," he growled into the comm, "not to traitors and backstabbers." A plan was forming in his mind, desperate and dangerous. The Zephyrian tech they had captured, if they could use it to infiltrate the Deltan cruiser, to strike at the heart of their betrayers. He gathered his soldiers around him, his voice low and fierce. The Deltans think they have us beaten. They think we'll roll over and die like good little pawns, but they're wrong. We're human. We don't give up. We don't back down. He met each of their gazes in turn. We've bled together. We've lost friends, brothers and sisters in arms, and now our comrades in the sky need us. We're going to show these Deltan bastards what it means to betray humanity. A chorus of grim approval met his words. Alexander felt a surge of pride. These were his people, his family, and he would lead them to victory or die trying. As the preparation for their final desperate mission began, the old soldier's voice grew quiet. This was the calm before the storm, the deep breath before the plunge. In the hours to come, the fate of his ship, his crew, and perhaps the future of humanity itself would be decided. Alexander looked to the stars, to the cold void that had once held such promise, such hope for a united future. Now it seemed filled only with treachery and death. But as long as a single human drew breath, as long as soldiers like these stood ready to fight and die for each other, there was still hope. The Deltans would learn, as so many had before, the true strength of the human spirit. The old veteran's eyes gleamed with a fierce light as he recounted those final fateful hours. The story of Lieutenant Alexander Robertson and the soldiers of the Defiant was nearing its climax, but the true test, the moment that would define them all, was yet to come. The narrator's voice trailed off, leaving his audience captivated and breathless. The tale of humanity's greatest trial was not yet done. The old soldier paused, gathering his thoughts and his strength. For the memories that came next, the final acts of this cosmic drama, would be the hardest to relive. But relive them he must, for the sake of the fallen, for the sake of the future. Lieutenant Alexander Robertson steeled himself, ready to once again face the ghosts of his past. The story, like the battle itself, demanded to be finished, no matter the cost. The old veteran's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper as he described the audacious plan. Under the cover of darkness, Alexander and his hand-picked team slipped aboard the captured Zephyrian stealth shuttle. Hearts pounding, they ran through final checks, knowing that the slightest misstep could spell their doom. "This is it," Alexander muttered, his grip tightening on the controls. "No turning back now." With a barely perceptible shimmer, the shuttle eased out of the hangar, gliding through the void towards the looming Deltan cruiser. The massive vessel grew larger in their view screen, its hull pulsing with eerie bioluminescence. "Their defenses are formidable," Sergeant Hawkins murmured, her eyes scanning the readouts. "But they're not expecting us. Not like this." Alexander nodded grimly. The Zephyrian tech was their ace in the hole, their one chance to even the odds. As they approached the cruiser, he felt a bead of sweat trickle down his spine, the tension in the shuttle's cockpit almost unbearable. Miraculously, they slipped through the Deltan defenses undetected, the shuttle's advanced cloaking holding steady. With a soft thud, they docked on the cruiser's underside, the magnetic clamps locking into place. The team split up as they emerged into the alien vessel, each soldier moving towards their pre-assigned target. Alexander took point, his modified Deltan weapon humming with barely restrained power. The interior of the cruiser was a disorienting maze of winding corridors and pulsing lights, the very air seeming to throb with an unsettling energy. Strange symbols glowed on the walls, the curved architecture both beautiful and unnerving. As they pressed deeper into the ship, they encountered the first signs of resistance. Deltan soldiers, alerted to the intrusion, poured into the corridors, their weapons spitting streams of searing energy. Alexander and his team met them head-on, the confined spaces erupting into a brutal close-quarters battle. The modified Deltan weapons proved their worth, punching through the enemy's advanced armor with devastating effect. But the Deltans were elite warriors, and they fought with a ferocity that matched the humans' own. Alexander found himself separated from his team, driven back by a relentless onslaught of fire. Cornered and desperate, he made a split-second decision. With a roar of defiance, he unleashed the full power of his weapon, a blinding beam of energy that vaporized his attackers where they stood. But the blast also tore into the ship's hull, alarms blaring as the damage spread. Alexander knew they were out of time. Gritting his teeth, he forged ahead, determined to finish the mission no matter the cost. He reached the bridge just as the last of his team arrived, their armor scorched and battered. The door stood before them, a final barrier between them and their target. With a nod, they breached, storming onto the bridge in a hail of fire. But the sight that greeted them stopped them cold. The Deltan commander stood at the center of the room, a cruel smile on his lips. Around him, a phalanx of his most elite soldiers stood ready, their weapons trained on the humans. "Ah, Lieutenant Robertson," the commander drawled. "I was wondering when you'd arrive." Alexander's grip tightened on his weapon, his mind racing. They were outgunned and outmaneuvered, the Deltan holding all the cards. "Surrender," the commander demanded, his voice dripping with disdain, "or watch your precious Defiant burn." A view screen flickered to life, the battered human ship hanging vulnerable in the void. Alexander felt his heart clench, the lives of his crew hanging in the balance. But as he stared into the commander's arrogant eyes, a flash of insight struck him. This Deltan, for all his power, was ruled by pride, and pride could be a deadly weakness. "You know, I was wrong about you," Alexander said casually, his voice carrying across the sudden silence of the bridge. The commander's eyes narrowed. "Oh?" "I thought you were a warrior," Alexander continued, a mocking edge to his words. "But look at you hiding behind your soldiers. Where's the honor in that?" "I dare," Alexander shot back, "because you're nothing but a coward, a puppet dancing on your master's strings." With a roar of fury, the commander ordered his men to attack, but Alexander was ready. In a blur of motion, he hurled a concealed EMP grenade, the pulse washing over the Deltans in a wave of crackling energy. Their weapons and shields shorted out, leaving them vulnerable. And then all hell broke loose. Alexander launched himself at the commander, the two leaders crashing together in a titanic clash of wills. Around them, human and Deltan soldiers grappled in desperate hand-to-hand combat, the fate of both their races hanging in the balance. The narrator's voice grew hushed, his audience leaning forward in rapt attention. The battle for the Deltan cruiser had reached its pivotal moment. The outcome and the future of the war itself would be decided here, in the heart of the enemy ship. Fists and feet flew as Alexander and the Deltan commander traded blows, their personal duel a microcosm of the larger conflict that had engulfed their civilizations. The human's face was a mask of determination, his every strike fueled by the memory of the betrayals and losses he had suffered. But the Deltan commander was a formidable opponent, his skills honed by a lifetime of warfare. He met Alexander's attacks with a fluid grace, his counter-strikes precise and deadly. The old soldier's breath came in ragged gasps as he relived the desperate struggle. Locked in mortal combat with the Deltan commander, Alexander fought with the strength of a man possessed. The two warriors grappled and strained, their muscles bulging with effort. The commander sneered, his face inches from Alexander's. "You fight well for a human, but it's futile. Your species is doomed." "Zephyrus was just the beginning," the commander gloated, pressing his advantage. "Even now our forces gather on your borders. Soon we will sweep across your worlds like a plague. Your people will serve us or perish." Alexander's blood ran cold. The scope of the Deltan's treachery was beyond anything he'd imagined. Rage and desperation surged through him, fueling his battered body. So with a roar of defiance, he launched himself at the commander, his attacks a whirlwind of strikes and counters. The Deltan met him blow for blow, his superior strength slowly wearing Alexander down. They crashed against a console, sparks flying. Alexander's hand scrabbled for purchase, his fingers closing around a hard cylindrical object, a Deltan combat knife. The commander's eyes widened as Alexander brought the blade to bear. For a heartbeat, they were frozen, poised on the razor's edge between life and death. Then Alexander struck, the knife plunging into the commander's chest. The Deltan's mouth opened in a soundless scream, his eyes bulging with shock and pain. Alexander twisted the blade, his face a mask of grim determination. "This is for every human life you've taken, for every betrayal, for Fornax." The commander slumped to the deck, his lifeblood pooling beneath him. Around the bridge, Deltan soldiers stood stunned, their weapons wavering. "Drop your weapons," Alexander commanded, his voice ringing with authority. "Your commander is dead. This ship is now under human control." One by one, the Deltans complied, their weapons clattering to the floor. Alexander's team moved quickly to secure them, relief and triumph etched on their faces. But even as they took control of the cruiser, ensuring the safety of the Defiant and her crew, Alexander knew their fight was far from over. The Deltans' plan, the looming invasion, hung over them like a shadow. The narrator's voice was heavy with the weight of the revelation. As Alexander and his team returned to the Defiant, the truth of the Deltans' intentions spread through the fleet like wildfire. Shock gave way to anger, then to a cold, steely resolve. Humans stood at consoles, their faces lit by the glow of tactical displays. Engineers swarmed over damaged systems, effecting repairs with grim efficiency. In the corridors, soldiers checked their weapons, their eyes hard with determination. They knew now that they were fighting not just for their lives, but for the very future of humanity, against odds greater than any they had ever faced. The old soldier paused, his gaze distant. In that moment, as the fleet prepared for war, Alexander became a symbol, a hero, the man who had unmasked the Deltan threat and struck the first blow against our would-be conquerors. His voice dropped, barely a whisper, but the true test was yet to come. Against the full might of the Deltan war machine, against fleets and armies beyond counting, could one man, could humanity, prevail? The question hung in the air, a challenge and a prophecy. The old soldier seemed to gather himself, his eyes glinting with a fire undimmed by the passage of years. Alexander would face trials and challenges unimaginable. He would be tested in ways no human had ever been tested before. The fate of worlds would rest on his shoulders. The narrator leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But that, my friends, is a story for another time. For now, let us remember the lesson of Zephyrus, the lesson of the Deltan betrayal." His voice rose, ringing with conviction. "Let us remember that in the vastness of the cosmos, humanity stands alone. Our strength, our unity, our indomitable will. These are the shields that guard the realms of man." He raised a fist, his eyes blazing, and woe betide any who would test them. The narrator's voice grew heavy as he recounted the early days of the war. The human fleet, outnumbered and outgunned by the Deltans, was forced to resort to guerrilla tactics. They struck at supply convoys and communication relays, bleeding the enemy with 1,000 cuts. The audience leaned forward, hanging on every word. The narrator painted a picture of daring raids and desperate battles, of human ingenuity pitted against Deltan might. "But the cost," he said, his voice dropping, "the cost was high. Every mission, every engagement, they knew it could be their last. The toll it took on Alexander and his crew." He shook his head, the memories clearly still raw. They faced horrors out there in the void, things that would break lesser men. But Alexander, he held them together. His leadership, his unwavering resolve, it kept them going even in the darkest times. The narrator's tone shifted, becoming almost conspiratorial. "But there was hope," he said, "a secret project known only to a select few. Alexander and our best scientists, they were working on something, a weapon that could change everything." The audience held its collective breath, sensing the impending revelation. Using what we'd learned from the Deltan ship, they toiled in secret, pouring all our hopes into this one desperate gambit. But then, His voice hardened, anger flashing in his eyes. Then it all went to hell. Sabotage, a Deltan spy lurking in our midst, the prototype destroyed, scientists dead, all our work undone. Fists clenched, jaws tightened. The betrayal even now ignited a fury in the hearts of all who heard it. Alexander, when he learned what had happened, I'd never seen him like that, the guilt, the rage. He vowed to hunt that spy down, to make them pay for what they'd done. The narrator's voice quickened, the tale unfolding at a breakneck pace. A desperate chase across the stars, a trail of clues and near misses. Alexander and his team, always one step behind, driven by a thirst for justice. They finally ran the bastard to ground on some godforsaken asteroid, and that's when all hell broke loose. The audience could almost hear the sounds of battle, could almost smell the acrid scent of burning circuitry. Alexander fought like a man possessed, throwing himself into the fray with no regard for his own safety. He took hits that would have killed any other man, but he just kept coming. The narrator's voice was raw, the memory of that terrible battle still fresh in his mind. In the end he got his man, dragged the spy back in chains to face the justice of our people. But the cost, the wounds he suffered, both physical and mental. He trailed off, the weight of those unseen scars heavy in the air. But Alexander, he wasn't done. Even as he healed, he was planning, plotting our next move. He knew that weapon was our last, best hope, and he was determined to see it through no matter the cost. The narrator leaned back, his tale reaching a momentary lull, but the fire in his eyes made it clear that the story, like the war itself, was far from over. What came next, well, that's a tale for another time. But know this, Alexander never stopped fighting, not until the very end, and that, my friends, is why we're still here today. The narrator's voice took on a note of cautious optimism as he described the feverish work on the secret weapon. With the Deltan spy in custody and the sabotage halted, human engineers and scientists redoubled their efforts, working around the clock to bring the project to fruition. At the heart of it all was Alexander, newly promoted to admiral in recognition of his unwavering leadership and tactical brilliance. He oversaw every aspect of the weapon's development, poring over schematics and simulations, pushing his team to their limits and beyond. It was a sight to behold, the old soldier said, a hint of pride in his voice. Every man and woman, from the lowliest technician to the most brilliant scientist, giving their all. They knew what was at stake, knew that this weapon could be our last, best hope. As the final components were slotted into place and the last tests run, Alexander gathered his senior staff for a briefing. The room was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. It's an EMP device, Alexander explained, his voice steady, but on a scale we've never seen before. When activated, it will send out a pulse that will disable any Deltan ship within its radius. Weapons, shields, engines, all of it will be fried. There was a murmur of excitement, tempered by the knowledge of what it would take to deploy such a weapon. Alexander held up a hand for silence. But to use it effectively, we need to get the Deltans to commit their main fleet. We need to draw them out, make them think they have us on the ropes. And that means putting our own ships at risk. The plan he outlined was daring to the point of recklessness. The Defiant, along with a hand-picked group of ships, would launch a frontal assault on a key Deltan stronghold. The attack would be designed to look like a desperate last-ditch effort, a gamble by a fleet on its last legs. We'll take casualties, Alexander said bluntly, heavy casualties. But if we can pull the Deltan fleet out of position, if we can lure them into the trap, it will be worth it. The narrator's voice grew tense as he recounted the opening moves of the battle. The human ships, engines straining, hurtled towards the Deltan base, weapons blazing. The Deltans responded with all the force they could muster, their ships swarming out to meet the attackers. On the bridge of the Defiant, Alexander gripped the arms of his command chair, his eyes locked on the tactical display. He watched as ship after ship winked out, human and Deltan alike. The cost was staggering, but the plan was working. The Deltan fleet was moving into position, drawn by the lure of an easy victory. "Hold course," Alexander ordered, his voice calm despite the chaos erupting around him. "Just a little longer." At the crucial moment, with the Deltan ships arrayed perfectly, Alexander gave the order. Far behind the battle lines, the EMP weapon flared to life, a blinding burst of energy that seemed to swallow the stars themselves. When the glare faded, the battlefield had transformed. The Deltan ships hung dead in space, their lights extinguished, their systems fried. For a moment, there was an eerie, expectant silence. Then, one by one, the human ships began to come back online. Engines flickered, weapons arrays hummed with renewed power. The modifications made by the human engineers, the fail-safes and redundancies, had worked. The fleet was battered, but unbroken. Alexander wasted no time pressing the advantage. Even as his ships regrouped, he was marshalling a boarding party, preparing to take the fight to the heart of the Deltan command. "We're going to end this," he told his troops, his voice ringing with conviction. "Here and now." They struck like lightning, breaching the hull of the Deltan flagship and storming its corridors. Resistance was fierce but disorganized, the Deltan crew still reeling from the EMP blast. Step by step, deck by deck, they fought their way towards the bridge. Alexander was at the forefront, his weapon blazing, his face set in a mask of grim determination. And then, in a moment that seemed to stretch for an eternity, he found himself face to face with a ghost from his past. Fornax, the Deltan warrior who had betrayed them on Zephyrus, stood blocking the path, his weapon leveled at Alexander's chest. "You," Alexander breathed, his voice raw with anger and pain. "I should have known." Fornax's mandibles twitched in what might have been a smile. "You humans," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "so predictable, so emotional." They clashed in a whirlwind of blades and fists, a duel that was as much personal as it was a microcosm of the larger war. Around them, human and Deltan soldiers fought and died, but for Alexander, in that moment, there was only Fornax. It was a battle of skill and strength, of fury and desperation. They traded blows that would have felled lesser warriors, each driven by a lifetime of training and a burning need to prove their cause just. The narrator's voice was hoarse with emotion as he described the final, fateful moments of the duel. Alexander, battered and bleeding, lunged forward in a last desperate attack. The narrator's voice strained with the effort of recounting the brutal confrontation. Sparks flew as Alexander's blade clashed against Fornax's, the ring of metal on metal echoing through the Deltan ship's corridors. The human and Deltan crews watched in awe as their leaders dueled with a skill and ferocity that defied belief. "You never could see the bigger picture, Alexander," Fornax taunted, his mandibles clicking with each word. "I've been pulling the strings all along, using your human weaknesses against you." Alexander's eyes widened with shocked realization. Fornax had been behind the Deltan's war efforts from the very beginning, exploiting his intimate knowledge of human tactics and vulnerabilities. Rage boiled up inside Alexander, fueling his attacks. He pressed forward, his blade a blur as he drove Fornax back with a relentless flurry of strikes. The Deltan warrior struggled to parry the onslaught, his own attacks becoming more desperate. But even as Alexander gained the upper hand, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He spun, his heart sinking as he saw a group of Deltan soldiers emerging from hidden alcoves, their weapons trained on his boarding party. Fornax had been stalling, buying time for his reinforcements to arrive. Alexander hesitated, torn between his burning desire for vengeance and his duty to protect his crew. In that split second of indecision, Fornax lunged, his blade arcing towards Alexander's throat. But Alexander's reflexes, honed by years of battle, saved him. He parried the blow and disengaged, turning his back on his nemesis and charging towards his beleaguered comrades. Plasma bolts sizzled past him as he dove into the fray, his own weapon spitting fire. He put himself between his crew and the Deltan ambush, shielding them with his own body. "To the bridge!" he roared over the chaos of battle. "We end this now!" Inch by blood-soaked inch, Alexander and his boarding party fought their way through the Deltan ship, leaving a trail of broken bodies in their wake. They reached the bridge, ready to confront the Deltan leadership and force an end to the war. But as the doors slid open, they found only emptiness. The Deltan commanders had fled, escaping in pods that even now vanished into the void of space. Alexander slammed his fist into a bulkhead, frustration and exhaustion warring within him. They had come so close only to be thwarted at the last moment. As his crew secured the Deltan flagship, reports flooded in from the rest of the human fleet. The EMP weapon had been a resounding success, leaving the majority of the Deltan forces crippled and vulnerable. But even as cheers of victory echoed over the comms, Alexander couldn't shake a nagging sense of unease. Something wasn't right. "Search the ship," he ordered his crew. "Every deck, every compartment. Look for anything out of place." It was in the Deltan ship's medical bay that they found it. Hidden behind layers of encryption, a single file that laid bare the true horror of the Deltans' plan. They had never sought to conquer humanity. Conquest was too merciful for the Deltans' tastes. The narrator's voice grew grim as he revealed the depths of the Deltans' malevolence. They had engineered a bioweapon, a virulent plague designed to target human DNA specifically, and with the bulk of the human fleet gathered in one place, the perfect delivery system was at hand. Alexander's blood ran cold as the implications sank in. The war, the battles, the countless lives lost. It had all been a ruse, a distraction to lure humanity into a trap of their own making. And now, with the fleet vulnerable and the Deltan leadership escaped, that trap was about to spring shut. The narrator's voice grew heavy with emotion as he recounted the final desperate hours of the battle. Alexander, his face grim with determination, stood on the bridge of the Defiant. The knowledge of the Deltan bioweapon weighed heavy on his shoulders, a terrible truth that threatened to extinguish the flame of humanity. His crew, loyal to the end, nodded in solemn agreement. They knew the price of survival, and they were ready to pay it. Alexander gave the order, his words carried across the fleet by the cold digital signal of the comm systems. "All ships, evacuate your crews. I repeat, all ships evacuate. Leave only a skeleton force to pilot the vessels." Across the battlefield, escape pods burst from the hulls of human ships like seeds scattered on the solar wind. They fled, carrying the precious cargo of human lives, the last hope for a future. On the bridge of the Defiant, Alexander turned to his remaining crew, a handful of volunteers who had chosen to stand with him in this final hour. Among them were the faces he knew best, the men and women who had been with him since the beginning. "We're going to overload the reactors," he told them, his voice steady. "We'll create a blast big enough to incinerate the Deltan bioweapon before they can use it." They set to work, hands flying over consoles, coaxing the ship's systems to accept this final fatal command. As they worked, a signal chimed on the comm, a transmission from an unexpected source. Alexander accepted the call, and the view screen flickered to life. There, slumped against a terminal, was Fornax. The Deltan warrior, his body broken from their earlier duel, had dragged himself to the comm with the last of his strength. "Alexander," Fornax rasped, his voice thick with pain, "I must tell you the truth." Alexander leaned forward, his eyes locked on the screen. "Speak," he commanded. "The Deltans. We were never acting alone," Fornax whispered. "We were pawn in a larger game, a cabal of alien races. They fear humanity, seek to destroy you." Alexander's blood ran cold. The scope of the threat, the depth of the conspiracy was beyond anything he had imagined. "Who are they?" he demanded. "The ones pulling the strings?" But Fornax, his strength fading, could only shake his head. "Beware," he breathed, his final words a warning. "They are watching, waiting." The screen went dark, leaving Alexander alone with the weight of this revelation. He turned to his crew, saw the same shock and determination mirrored in their faces. "You heard him," Alexander said, his voice hard. "We're not just fighting for today, we're fighting for tomorrow, for the very future of our species." They returned to their work with renewed urgency, the timer on the reactor charges ticking down with merciless precision. As the final seconds slipped away, Alexander found his thoughts turning to the past, to that fateful day on Zephyrus when he had first glimpsed the true face of the enemy. And then, with a blinding flash of light that outshone the stars themselves, the reactors detonated. The explosion consumed the Deltan fleet, the bioweapon, everything, in a maelstrom of fire and radiation. The shockwave rippled outward, a testament to the power of human resolve. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.